Hello and welcome to Synthetic History, where the past speaks again, but not through dusty archives or faded manuscripts. Here, we use generative AI tools to resurrect history's lost stories, forgotten places, silenced voices, and the echoes of time itself. This isn't just storytelling, it's a collaboration between human researchers and AI agents, weaving together historical fact and imagination with precision. Every episode is a bridge between what was and what could be remembered. And now, let's begin. Here's our new episode.
The Unseen Footprint. Part 1. The Ancient Paths That Connect Us. The trail is old, older than the town, older than the fences that crisscross the land, older than the maps that try to tell us what belongs to whom. You wouldn't notice it at first, just a narrow path winding through the woods carved into the earth by thousands of years of footsteps. What we call the Mohawk Trail today began as a Native American trade route connecting Atlantic tribes with nations in upstate New York and beyond, following the Millers River, Deerfield River, and crossing the Hoosac Range. These were not simple footpaths, but sophisticated transportation networks connecting diverse peoples across vast distances. A hiking trail, they call it now. But if you know where to look, if you listen, you might see something more. You might see the past pressing through the surface. You might see the unseen footprint of a world that was never lost, only obscured by layers of newer stories. Part 2. The Peoples Who Shaped This Land. Once, before the roads, before the rails, before the rivers were dammed and the hills were cleared, this land was alive with movement. Paths stretched across what we now call Western Massachusetts, linking villages, trading posts, and sacred sites. The people who walked them, the Pocumtuck, the Nipmuc, the Mohican, knew these trails as intimately as they knew the changing seasons that guided their lives. The Pocumtuckan people, whose homeland included what would eventually become Deerfield, lived not in large permanent settlements, but in small clusters of wigwams, also called wedus, connected by a network of paths. These dwellings were sometimes palisaded for protection. Their lives followed the rhythms of the land, moving to riverbanks during farming and fishing seasons, then to more protected areas during the fall and winter. Some trails led to rivers where salmon ran thick in the shallows. The Woronoko people, whose name survives in altered form as Westfield, established a village of over 1,000 along the banks of what we now call the Westfield River, where they fished, hunted, and planted for thousands of years. Other paths led to places where the boundaries between worlds seemed thinner, a stone circle nestled deep in the hills. In places like Burnt Hill in Franklin County, mysterious arrangements of stones weighing up to 500 pounds remain, possibly ancient observatories aligned with celestial movements. On Grassy Pond in Westford, drought occasionally reveals stone circles that speak to an earlier human presence. To most modern visitors, they are just curious geological features, but to those who remember, they are something more: a map, a memory, a footprint that refuses to fade.
Part 3. Keepers of Knowledge. Sarah Wakewash walks the trail alone. She does not carry a map. She does not need one. Her grandmother brought her here once when she was young, when she still believed that the past was something solid, something permanent. "Do you see?" her grandmother had asked, kneeling in the dirt, tracing the outline of a stone with her fingers. "Do you see what they left behind?" Sarah had squinted, had tried to see what she could not yet understand. Now, years later, she sees. The stones are still here. The path is still here. The Nipmuc, the freshwater people who occupied much of central Massachusetts, were not wanderers as often portrayed, but careful planners and good stewards of the land upon which they lived. Their villages were linked by kinship ties, trade alliances, and shared challenges. The world has changed. The forests have thickened, then thinned, then thickened again. Towns have spread, but beneath it all, the old roads still run through the land like veins through a body. and Sarah knows what her grandmother knew. The land remembers, even when people forget. Part 4. The Language of Stone and Earth. Farther up the trail, she finds them, the stones, large, smooth, arranged in a way that no glacier, no accident of nature could have placed them. Once, these stones marked something. Archaeological evidence shows the Middle Connecticut River Valley to have been inhabited by indigenous peoples for at least 12,000 years, from the end of the Wisconsin glaciation. The word Pocumtuck derives from an Algonquian locative word that variously translates to indicate a place beside a narrow, swift river, or a short, shallow, sandy river, accurately characterizing the Deerfield River as it changes character through its course. Some say the stones are just relics, left behind by those who no longer walk this land. But historical erasure has obscured much of this complex history. During the 1800s, Deerfield historian George Sheldon depicted the changing indigenous population as a vanishing act and refused to acknowledge the presence of living native descendants. Sarah knows better. They are not relics, they are messages, proof that this land was never empty and never will be.
Part 5. The Rivers That Sustain. The Westfield River runs like a silver thread through the valley, cutting through time itself. Sarah kneels at the water's edge, pressing her palm against the earth. Once, her ancestors fished here. Once, they knew when the salmon would run, when the eels would rise in the night, slipping between the rocks like silver ghosts. Dr. Bruhack, a professor who studies indigenous history in this region, speaks of Rhoda Rhodes, a renowned Mohican Indian doctress from Indian Hollow who traveled widely in the region practicing her art of healing. This knowledge of plants, animals, and seasonal cycles was not primitive superstition, but sophisticated ecological understanding developed over thousands of years. Now, the fish are fewer. The dams have changed the water's flow. The old ways of reading the river are slipping away. But still, if you know where to look, there are signs. The Mohican people chose to build their homes near the rivers, where they would be close to food, water, and transportation. Their lives were rooted in the rhythms of the natural world, and they took only what they needed to survive. The knowledge is still there, waiting. Part 6. The Landscape of Memory. Sarah stands on the hilltop, looking down at the valley. A town sits below her, where once there was a Pocumtuck village. A highway cuts across what was once part of the Mohawk Trail that traversed from the Hudson and Mohawk River valleys to the Deerfield and Connecticut River valleys. But if you strip away the houses, the roads, the fences, what do you see? Prior to European settlement, the Mohawk and other Native American tribes utilized this trail to fish during the annual spring salmon runs up the Connecticut and Deerfield rivers, and to hunt in the lush valleys. The land between Sunsica, Stony Hills, now called West Mountain, and Pemawachua-Tunk, winding hills, the Pocumtuck Range, constituted the center of the Pocumtuck homeland. A river that has not changed its course. A ridge where the deer still walk, just as they always have. A stone that still watches the stars, just as it did before anyone called this place Massachusetts. Sarah smiles. The land remembers, even when people forget.
Part 7. Enduring Presence. Not all history is written in books. Some of it is written in stone, in rivers, in paths that never disappeared, only faded from sight. The indigenous knowledge of this land, its seasons, its rhythms, its voices, is still here, though often overlooked. The Pocumtuck did not simply vanish as colonial narratives suggest. During the hostilities of the 1670s to the mid-1700s, many of the valley's native people folded into the populations of surrounding tribes, and documentation on them diminished. The Mohican, too, faced displacement. Some eventually relocated to what is now Wisconsin, where they continue as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. The Nipmuc remain as well, with communities continuing to maintain their cultural heritage. And if we listen, if we look closely, we can find their enduring influence. History does not vanish, it lingers. It waits. It remembers. The paths remain, now called the Mohawk Trail State Forest, providing camping and hiking opportunities while protecting some of Massachusetts's oldest growth forests and tallest trees. The rivers still flow, though changed by dams and development, and the knowledge of plants, seasons, ecological relationships offers wisdom increasingly valued in our changing world. The land was never empty, and the footprints never truly disappeared. They're there for those willing to see them, offering guidance for the path ahead.
That's it for this episode of Synthetic History. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, help us keep these forgotten voices alive by sharing the podcast on social media and with anyone who loves history told in a new way. You can find Synthetic History on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So, be sure to subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the past alive. See you in the next episode.